Chapter 5 of Daniel Boone by John S. C. Abbott. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 5. Indian Warfare. The valley of the Clinch River is but one of the many magnificent ravines amid the gigantic ranges of the Alleghany Mountains. Boone, speaking of these ridges which he so often had occasion to cross, says: "These mountains in the wilderness, as we pass from the old settlements in Virginia to Kentucky, are ranged in a southwest and northeast direction, and are of great length and breadth, and not far distant from each other. Over them nature hath formed passes that are less difficult than might be expected from a view of such huge piles. The aspect of these cliffs is so wild and horrid that it is impossible to behold them without terror. The spectator is apt to imagine that nature has formerly suffered some violent convulsion, and that these are the dismembered remains of the dreadful shock. One cannot but regret that no memorials are left of a wonderful journey, full of romantic interest and exciting adventure, which Boone at one time took to the Falls of the Ohio, to warn some surveyors of their danger. He reached them in safety, rescued them from certain death, and conducted them triumphantly back to the settlements. So long as the white men, with their rifles, could keep upon the open prairie, they could defend themselves from almost any number of Indians, who could only assail them with bows and arrows. But the moment they entered the forest, or any ravine among the hills, the little band was liable to hear the war whoop of 1,000 Indian braves in the ambush around, and to be assailed by a storm of arrows and javelins from unseen hands. A few days after Boone's arrival at the encampment near the Falls of the Ohio, and as the surveyors were breaking camp in preparation for their precipitate retreat, several of their number who had gone to a spring at a short distance from the camp were suddenly attacked on the 20th of July by a large party of Indians. One was instantly killed. The rest, being nearly surrounded, fled as best they could in all directions. One man hotly pursued, rushed along an Indian trail till he reached the Ohio River. Here he chanced to find a bark canoe. He jumped into it and pushed out into the rapid stream till beyond the reach of the Indian arrows. The swift current bore him down the river, by curves and headlands, till he was far beyond the encampment. To return against the strong flood, with the savages watching for him, seemed perilous, if not impossible. It is said that he floated down the whole length of the Ohio and of the Mississippi, a distance not less probably, counting the curvatures of the stream, than 2,000 miles, and finally found his way by sea to Philadelphia, probably in some vessel which he encountered near the coast. This is certainly one of the most extraordinary voyages which ever occurred. It was midsummer, so that he could not suffer from cold. Grapes often hung in rich clusters in the forests which lined the river banks, and various kinds of nutritious berries were easily gathered to satisfy hunger. As these men never went into the forest without the rifle and a supply of ammunition, and as they never lost a bullet by an inaccurate shot, it is not probable that our adventurers suffered from hunger. But the incidents of such a voyage must have been so wonderful that it is greatly to be regretted that we have no record of them. The apprehensions of Lord Dunmore respecting the conspiracy of the Indians proved to have been well founded. Though Boone, with his great sagacity, led his little band by safe paths back to the settlements, a very fierce warfare immediately blazed forth all along the Virginia frontier. This conflict with the Indians, very brief and very bloody, is usually called Lord Dunmore's War. The white men have told the story, and they admit that the war arose in consequence of cold-blooded murders committed upon inoffensive Indians in the region of the upper Ohio. One of the provocatives to this war was the assassination by fiend-like white men of the whole family of the renowned Indian chief, Logan, in the vicinity of the city of Wheeling. Logan had been the friend of the white man, but exasperated by these outrages, he seized his tomahawk, breathing only vengeance. General Gibson was sent to one of the Shawnees towns to confer with Logan and to detach him from the conspiracy against the whites. It was on this occasion that Logan made that celebrated speech whose pathetic eloquence will ever move the human heart. I appeal to any white man to say if ever he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and I gave him not meat; if ever he came cold or naked, and I gave him not clothing. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained in his tent, an advocate of peace. Nay, such was my love for the whites, that those of my own country pointed at me and said, 'Logan is a friend of white men.' I had even thought to live with you, but for the injuries of one man. Colonel Cresap, the last spring, in cold blood and unprovoked, cut off all the relatives of Logan, not sparing even my women and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any human creature. This called on me for revenge. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace. Yet do not harbor the thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not return on his hill to save his life. Who is there to mourn for Logan?" This war, though it lasted but a few months, was very sanguinary. Every exposed point on the extensive Virginia frontier was assailed. Cabins were burned. Harvests were trampled down. Cattle driven off, and men, women, and children either butchered or carried into captivity more dreadful than death. The peril was so dreadful that the most extraordinary efforts on the part of the Virginian government were requisite to meet it. An army of 3,000 men was raised in the utmost haste. This force was in two divisions. One of 1,100 men rendezvoused in what is now Greenbrier County, and marched down the valley of the Great Kanawha to its entrance into the Ohio, at a place now named Point Pleasant. Lord Dunmore, with the remaining 1,900, crossed the Cumberland Mountains to Wheeling, and thence descended the Ohio in boats, to form a junction with the other party at the mouth of the Great Kanawha. Thence united, they were to march across the country about 40 miles due west, to the valley of the Scioto. The banks of this lovely stream were lined with Indian villages, in a high state of prosperity. Cornfields waved luxuriantly around their humble dwellings. They were living at peace with each other, and relied far more upon the produce of the soil than upon the chase for their support. It was the plan of Lord Dunmore to sweep this whole region with utter desolation, and entirely to exterminate the Indians. But the savages did not await his arrival in their own homes. Many of them had obtained guns and ammunition from the French in Canada, with whom they seem to have lived on the most friendly terms. In a well-ordered army for Indian warfare, whose numbers cannot now with certainty be known, they crossed the Ohio below the mouth of the Great Kanawha, and marching through the forest, in the rear of the hills, fell by surprise very impetuously upon the rear of the encampment at Point Pleasant. The Indians seemed to be fully aware that their only safety was in the energies of desperation. One of the most bloody battles was then fought which ever occurred in Indian warfare. Though the Virginians with far more potent weapons repelled their assailants, they paid dearly for their victory. 215 of the Virginians fell dead or severely wounded beneath the bullets or arrows of their foes. The loss which the savages incurred could never be ascertained with accuracy. It was generally believed that several hundred of their warriors were struck down on that bloody field. The whites, accustomed to Indian warfare, and skilled in the use of the rifle, scarcely fired a shot which did not reach its mark. In the cautious warfare between the tribes, fighting with arrows from behind trees, the loss of 15 or 20 warriors was deemed a great calamity. Now to find hundreds of their braves weltering in blood was awful beyond precedent, and gave them new ideas of the prowess of the white man. In this conflict the Indians manifested a very considerable degree of military ability. Having constructed a breastwork of logs, behind which they could retreat in case of a repulse, They formed in a long line extending across the point from the Kanawha to the Ohio. Then they advanced in the impetuous attack through the forest, protected by logs and stumps and trees. Had they succeeded in their assault, there would have been no possible escape for the Virginian troops. They must have been annihilated. The Indians had assembled on that field nearly all the warriors of 4 powerful tribes, the Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and Wyandots. After the repulse, panic-stricken, they fled through the wilderness, unable to make any other stand against their foes. Lord Dunmore, with his triumphant army, flushed with victory and maddened by its serious loss, marched rapidly down the left bank of the Ohio, and then crossed into the valley of the Scioto to sweep it with flame. We have no accounts of the details of this cruel expedition, but the following graphic description of a similar excursion into the land belonging to the Cherokees will give one a vivid idea of the nature of these conflicts. The celebrated Francis Marion, who was an officer in the campaign, and an eye witness of the scenes which he describes, gives the following narrative of the events which ensued. Now commenced a scene of devastation scarcely paralleled in the annals of this continent. For 30 days the army employed themselves in burning and ravaging the settlements of the broken-spirited Indians. No less than 14 of their towns were laid in ashes. Their granaries were yielded to the flames, their cornfields ravaged, while the miserable fugitives, flying from the sword, took refuge with their starving families among the mountains. As the lands were rich and the season had been favorable, the corn was bending under the double weight of lusty roasting ears and pods and clustering beans. The furrows seemed to rejoice under their precious loads. The fields stood thick with bread. We encamped the first night in the woods near the fields, where the whole army feasted on the young corn, which, with fat venison, made a most delicious treat. The next morning, by order of Colonel Grant, we proceeded to burn down the Indian cabins. Some of our men seemed to enjoy this cruel work, laughing very heartily at the curling flames as they mounted loud crackling over the tops of the huts. But to me it appeared a shocking sight. Poor creatures, thought I, we surely need not grudge you such miserable habitations. But when we came according to orders to cut down the fields of corn, I could scarcely refrain from tears. For who could see the stalks that stood so stately, with broad green leaves and gaily tasseled shocks, filled with the sweet milky flower, the staff of life? Who, I say, could see without grief these sacred plants sinking under our swords with all their precious load, to wither and rot untasted in the fields? I saw everywhere around the footsteps of little Indian children, where they had lately played under the shelter of the rustling corn. No doubt they had often looked up with joy to the swelling shocks, and were gladdened when they thought of the abundant cakes for the coming winter. When we are gone, thought I, they will return, and peeping through the weeds, with tearful eyes, will mark the ghastly ruin poured over their homes and the happy fields where they had so often played. Such was life among the comparatively intelligent tribes in the beautiful and fertile valley of the Scioto. Such was the scene of devastation, or of punishing the Indians, as it was called, upon which Lord Dunmore's army entered, intending to sweep the valley with fire and sword from its opening at the Ohio to its headwaters leagues away in the north. In this campaign the Indians, while with much sagacity they combined their main force to encounter the army under Lord Dunmore, detached separate bands of picked warriors to assail the settlements on the frontier at every exposed point. These bands of painted savages, emerging from the solitudes of the forests at midnight, would fall with hideous yells upon the lone cabin of the settler, or upon a little cluster of log huts, and in a few hours nothing would be left but smouldering ruins and gory corpses. To Daniel Boone, who had manifested wonderful skill in baffling all the stratagems of Indian warfare, was assigned the difficult and infinitely important task of protecting these frontiers. 3 garrisons were placed under his command, over which he exercised supreme control. He located them at the most available points, noiselessly passed from one to the other to see that they were fortified according to the most approved principles of military engineering then known in the forest. His scouts were everywhere, to give prompt notice of any approach of hostile bands. Thus this quiet, silent man, with great efficiency, fulfilled his mission to universal satisfaction. Without seeking fame, without thinking even of such a reward for his services, his sagacity and his virtues were rapidly giving him a very enviable reputation throughout all those regions. The discomfited Indians had become thoroughly disheartened, and sent couriers to Lord Dunmore, imploring peace. Comstock, their chief, seems to have been a man not only of strong native powers of mind, but of unusual intelligence. With quite a brilliant retinue of his warriors, he met Lord Dunmore in council at a point in the valley of the Scioto, about 4 miles south of the present city of Circleville. Comstock himself opened the deliberations with a speech of great dignity and argumentative power. In a loud voice, which was heard as he intended by all in the camp, he portrayed the former prosperous condition of the Indian tribes, powerful in numbers and abounding in wealth, in the enjoyment of their rich cornfields and their forests filled with game. With this he contrasted very forcibly their present wretched condition, with diminished numbers, and with the loss of their hunting grounds. He reproached the whites with the violation of their treaty obligations, and declared that the Indians had been forbearing in the extreme under the wrongs which had been inflicted upon them. "We know," said he, "perfectly well our weakness when compared with the English. The Indians desire only justice. The war was not sought by us, but was forced upon us. It was commenced by the whites. We should have merited the contempt of every white man we could have tamely submitted to the murders which have been inflicted upon our unoffending people at the hands of the white men." The power was with Lord Dunmore. In the treaty of peace he exacted terms which, though very hard for the Indians, were perhaps not more than he had a right to require. The Indians surrendered 4 of their principal warriors as hostages for the faithful observance of the treaty. They relinquished all claims whatever to the vast hunting grounds which their bands from time immemorial had ranged south of the Ohio River. This was an immense concession. Lord Dunmore returned across the mountains well satisfied with his campaign, though his soldiers were excited almost to mutiny in not being permitted to wreak their vengeance upon the unhappy savages. And here let it be remarked that deeply wronged as these Indians unquestionably were, there was not a little excuse for the exasperation of the whites. Fiends incarnate could not have invented more terrible tortures than they often inflicted upon their captives. We have no heart to describe these scenes. They are too awful to be contemplated. In view of the horrid barbarity thus practised, it is not strange that the English should have wished to shoot down the whole race, men, women, and children, as they would exterminate wolves or bears. This campaign being thus successfully terminated, Daniel Boone returned to his humble cabin on the Clinch River. Here he had a small and fertile farm, which his energetic family had successfully cultivated during the summer, and he spent the winter months in his favorite occupation of hunting in the forests around. His thoughtful mind, during these long and solitary rambles, was undoubtedly occupied with plans for the future. Emigration to his beautiful Kentucky was still his engrossing thought. It is not wonderful that a man of such fearless temperament, and a natural turn of mind so poetic and imaginative, should have been charmed beyond expression by a realm whose attractions he had so fully experienced. That the glowing descriptions of Boone and Finley were not exaggerated, is manifest from the equally rapturous account of others who now began to explore this favored land. Imlay writes of that region: "Everything here assumes a dignity and splendor I have never seen in any other part of the world. You ascend a considerable distance from the shores of the Ohio, and when you would suppose you had arrived at the summit of a mountain, You find yourself upon an extensive level. Here an eternal verdure reigns, and the brilliant sun of latitude 39 degrees, piercing through the azure heavens, produces in this prolific soil an early maturity which is truly astonishing. Flowers full and perfect, as if they had been cultivated by the hand of a florist, with all their captivating odors, and with all the variegated charms which color and nature can produce, here in the lap of elegance and beauty decorate the smiling groves. Soft zephyrs gently breathe on sweets, and the inhaled air gives a glow of health and vigor that seems to ravish the intoxicated senses. The Virginian government now resolved to pour a tide of emigration into these as yet unexplored realms, south of the Ohio. 400 acres of land were offered to every individual who would build a cabin, clear a lot of land, and raise a crop of corn. This was called a settlement right. It was not stated how large the clearing should be, or how extensive the cornfield. Several settlements were thus begun in Kentucky, when there was a new and extraordinary movement which attracted universal attention. A very remarkable man, named Richard Henderson, appeared in North Carolina. Emerging from the humblest walks of life, and unable even to read until he had obtained maturity, he developed powers of conversational eloquence and administrative ability of the highest order. The Cherokee Indians claimed the whole country bounded by the Kentucky, the Ohio, and the Cumberland rivers, and we know not how much more territory extending indefinitely to the south and west. Colonel Henderson formed an association of gentlemen, which he called the Transylvania Company. Making a secret journey to the Cherokee country, he met 1,200 chiefs in council, and purchased of them the whole territory, equal to some European kingdoms, bounded by the above mentioned rivers. For this realm, above 100 miles square, he paid the insignificant sum of 10 wagon loads of cheap goods, with a few firearms and some spirituous liquors. Mr. Henderson, to whom the rest of the company seemed to have delegated all their powers, now assumed the position of proprietor, governor, and legislator of his magnificent domain, which he called Transylvania. It seems that Boone accompanied Colonel Henderson to the council of the Cherokee chieftains, which was held at Watauga, the southern branch of the Holston River. Boone had explored nearly the whole of this region, and it was upon his testimony that the company relied in endeavoring to purchase these rich and fertile lands. Indeed, as we have before intimated, it has been said that Boone in his wonderful and perilous explorations was the agent of this secret company. No treaties with the Indians were sure of general acquiescence. There were always discontented chieftains. There were almost always conflicting claims of hostile tribes. There were always wandering tribes of hunters and of warriors, who, exasperated by the treatment which they had received from vagabond white men, were ever ready to wreak their vengeance upon any band of emigrants they might encounter. Colonel Henderson's treaty was made in the month of March, 1775. With characteristic vigor he immediately made preparations for the settlement of the kingdom of which he was the proud monarch. The first thing to be done was to mark out a feasible path through which emigrants might pass, without losing their way, over the mountains and through the wilderness, to the heart of this new Eden. Of all the men in the world, Daniel Boone was the one to map out this route of 500 miles. He took with him a company of road makers, and in a few months opened a path which could be traversed by pack horses, and even by wagons, to a place called Boonesville, on the Kentucky River, within about 30 miles of the present site of Lexington. The Indian hunters and warriors, notwithstanding the treaties into which the chieftains of the North and the South had entered, watched the construction of this road with great solicitude. They knew full well that it would ere long secure their expulsion from their ancient hunting grounds. Though no general warfare was organized by the tribes, it was necessary to be constantly on the watch against lawless bands, who were determined to harass the pioneers in every possible way. In the following letter Boone communicated to Colonel Henderson the hostility which they had, perhaps unexpectedly, encountered. It was dated the 1st of April, and was sent back by a courier through the woods. Dear Colonel: After my compliments to you, I shall acquaint you with my misfortunes. On March the 25th, a party of Indians fired on my company about half an hour before day, and killed Mr. Twitty and his negro, and wounded Mr. Walker very deeply, but I hope he will recover. On March the 28th, as we were hunting for provisions, we found Samuel Tell's son, who gave us an account that the Indians fired on their camp on the 27th day. My brother and I went down and found 2 men killed and scalped, Thomas McDowell and Jeremiah McPeters. I have sent a man down to all the lower companies, in order to gather them all to the mouth of the Otter Creek. My advice to you, sir, is to come or send as soon as possible. Your company is greatly desired, for the people are very uneasy, but are willing to stay and venture their lives with you. And now is the time to frustrate their (the Indians) intentions, and keep the country while we are in it. If we give way to them now, it will ever be the case. This day we start from the battle ground, to the mouth of Otter Creek, where we shall immediately erect a fort, which will be done before you can come or send. Then we can send 10 men to meet you, if you send for them. I am, sir, your most obedient servant, Daniel Boone. Boone immediately commenced upon the left bank of the Kentucky River, which here ran in a westerly direction, the erection of a fort. Their position was full of peril, for the road makers were but few in number, and Indian warriors to the number of many hundreds might at any time encircle them. Many of these Indians had also obtained muskets from the French in Canada, and had become practiced marksmen. Nearly 3 months were busily occupied in the construction of this important fort. Fortunately, we have a minute description of its structure, and a sketch of its appearance, either from the pencil of Colonel Henderson, or of someone in his employ. The fort or fortress consisted of a series of strong log huts, enclosing a large interior or square. The parallelogram was about 260 feet in length, and 150 in breadth. These cabins, built of logs, were bullet proof. The intervals between them were filled with stout pieces of timber, about 12 feet high, planted firmly in the ground, in close contact with each other, and sharpened at the top. The fort was built close to the river, with one of its angles almost overhanging the water, so that an abundant supply could be obtained without peril. Each of the corner houses projected a little, so that from the portholes any Indian could be shot who should approach the walls with ladder or hatchet. This really artistic structure was not completed until the 14th day of June. The Indians from a distance watched its progress with dismay. They made one attack, but were easily repelled, though they succeeded in shooting one of the emigrants. Daniel Boone contemplated the fortress on its completion with much satisfaction. He was fully assured that behind its walls and palisades Bold Hearts, with an ample supply of ammunition, could repel any assaults which the Indians were capable of making. He now resolved immediately to return to Clinch River, and bring his family out to share with him his new and attractive home. Chapter 6 of Daniel Boone by John S.C. Abbott. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 6. Sufferings of the Pioneers. The fortress at Boonesboro consisted of 10 strong log huts arranged in a quadrangular form, enclosing an area of about 1/3 of an acre. The intervals, as before stated, between the huts were filled with strong palisades of timber, which, like the huts themselves, were bullet proof. The outer sides of the cabins, together with the palisades, formed the sides of the fort exposed to the foe. Each of these cabins was about 20 feet in length, and 12 or 15 in breadth. There were 2 entrance gates opposite each other, made of thick slabs of timber, and hung on wooden hinges. The forest, which was quite dense, had been cut away to such a distance as to expose an assailing party to the bullets of the garrison. As at that time the Indians were armed mainly with bows and arrows, a few men fully supplied with ammunition within the fort could bid defiance to almost any number of savages, and subsequently, as the Indians obtained firearms, they could not hope to capture the fort without a long siege, or by assailing it with a vastly overwhelming superiority of numbers. The accompanying illustration will give the reader a very correct idea of this renowned fortress of logs, which was regarded as the Gibraltar of Indian warfare. Having finished this fort, Daniel Boone, leaving a sufficient garrison for its security, set out for his home on the Clinch River to bring his wife and family to the beautiful land he so long had coveted for their residence. It seems that his wife and daughters were eager to follow their father to the banks of the Kentucky, whose charms he had so glowingly described to them. Several other families were also induced to join the party of emigration. They could dwell together in a very social community and in perfect safety in the spacious cabins within the fortress. The river would furnish them with an unfailing supply of water. The hunters, with their rifles, could supply them with game, and with those rifles could protect themselves while laboring in the fields, which, with the axe, they had laid open to the sun around the fort. The hunters and the farmers at night returning within the enclosure felt perfectly safe from all assaults. Daniel Boone commenced his journey with his wife and children, and others who joined them, back to Boonesboro in high spirits. It was a long journey of several hundred miles, and to many persons it would seem a journey fraught with great peril, for they were in danger almost every mile of the way, of encountering hostile Indians. But Boone, accustomed to traversing the wilderness, and accompanied by well-armed men, felt no more apprehensions of danger than the father of a family would at the present day in traveling by cars from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania. It was beautiful autumnal weather when the party of pioneers commenced its adventurous tour through the wilderness, to find a new home 500 miles beyond even the remotest frontiers of civilization. There were 3 families, besides that of Boone, and numbered in all 26 men, 4 women, and 4 or 5 boys and girls of various ages. Daniel Boone was the happy leader of this heroic little band. In due time they all arrived safely at Boonesboro, without having encountered, as Boone writes, any other difficulties than such as are common to this passage. As they approached the fort, Boone and his family, for some unexplained reason, pressed forward and entered the fortress a few days in advance of the rest of the party. Perhaps Boone himself had a little pride to have said it, that Mrs. Boone and her daughter were the first of her color and sex that ever stood upon the banks of the wild and beautiful Kentucky. A few days after their arrival, the emigrants had a very solemn admonition of the peril which surrounded them, and of the necessity of constant vigilance to guard against treacherous and sleepless foe. One of their number, who had sauntered but a short distance from the fort, lured by the combined beauty of the field, the forest, and the river, was shot by a prowling Indian, who, raising the war whoop of exultation and defiance, immediately disappeared in the depths of the wilderness. Colonel Henderson and his partners, anxious to promote the settlement of the country by organizing parties of emigration, were busy in making known through the settlements the absolute security of the fort at Boonesboro, and the wonderful attractions of the region, in soil, climate, and abounding game. Henderson himself soon started with a large party, 40 of whom were well armed. A number of pack horses conveyed the luggage of the emigrants. Following the very imperfect road that Boone with much skill had engineered, which was quite tolerable for pack horses in single file, they reached Boonesboro early in the following spring. The Transylvania Company was in the full flush of successful experiment. Small parties of emigrants were constantly arriving. Boonesboro was the capital of the colony. Various small settlements were settled in its vicinity. Colonel Henderson opened a land office there, and in the course of a few months over 500,000 of acres were entered by settlers or speculators. These men did not purchase the lands outright, but found themselves to pay a small but perpetual rent. The titles, which they supposed to be perfectly good, were given in the name of the proprietors of the colony of Transylvania in America. Soon 4 settlements were organized, called Boonesboro, Harrodsburg, Boiling Spring, and St. Asaph. Colonel Henderson, on the 23rd of May, 1775, as president, or rather sovereign of this extraordinary realm, summoned a legislature consisting of delegates from this handful of pioneers to meet at his capital, Boonesboro. Henderson presided. Daniel and his brother Squire were delegates from Boonesboro. A clergyman, the Reverend John Lythe, opened the session with prayer. Colonel Henderson made a remarkable and admirable speech. This extraordinary legislature represented by only a constituency of 150 souls. But the Colonel presented to them very clearly the true Republican principle of government. He declared that the only legitimate source of political power is to be found in the will of the people, and added, "If any doubts remain among you with respect to the force and efficiency of whatever laws you now or hereafter make, be pleased to consider that all power is originally in the people. Make it their interest, therefore, by impartial and beneficent laws, that you may be sure of their inclination to see them enforced." Rumors of these extraordinary proceedings reached the ears of Lord Dunmore. He considered the whole region of Kentucky as included in the original grant of Virginia, and that the government of Virginia alone had the right to extinguish the Indian title to any of those lands. He therefore issued a proclamation, denouncing in the severest terms the unlawful proceedings of one Richard Henderson and other disorderly persons, his associates. The legislature continued in session but 3 days, and honored itself greatly by its energetic action, and by the character of the laws which it inaugurated. One bill was introduced for preserving game, another for improving the breed of their horses, and it is worthy of especial record that a law was passed prohibiting profane swearing and Sabbath breaking. The moral sense of these bold pioneers was shocked at the desecration of the Creator's name among their sublime solitudes. The controversy between the Transylvania Company and the government of Virginia was short but very sharp. Virginia could then very easily send an army of several thousand men to exterminate the Kentucky colony. A compromise was the result. The title of Henderson was declared null and void, but he received in compensation a grant of land on the Ohio, about 12 miles square, below the mouth of the Green River. Virginia assumed that the Indian title was entirely extinguished, and the region called Transylvania now belonged without encumbrance to the Old Dominion. Still the tide of immigration continued to flow into this beautiful region. Among others came the family of Colonel Calloway, consisting of his wife and 2 daughters. For a long time no Indians had been seen in the vicinity of Boonesboro. No one seemed to apprehend the least danger from them, and the people in the fort wandered about as freely as if no foe had ever excited their fears. An accident occurred which sent a tremor of dismay through the whole colony, and which we will describe as related to the intelligent historian Peck from the lips of one of the parties who experienced all the terrors of the scene. On the 14th of July, 1776, Betsy Calloway, her sister Frances, and Jemima Boone, a daughter of Daniel Boone, the 2 last about 14 years of age, carelessly crossed the river opposite Boonesboro in a canoe, at a late hour in the afternoon. The trees and shrubs on the opposite bank were thick, and came down to the water's edge. The girls, unconscious of danger, were playing and splashing the water with their paddles, until the canoe, floating with the current, drifted near the shore. 5 stout Indians lay there concealed, one of whom, noiseless and stealthy as the serpent, crawled down the bank until he reached the rope that hung from the bow, turned its course up the stream, and in a direction to be hidden from the view of the fort. The loud shrieks of the captured girls were heard, but too late for their rescue. The canoe, their only means of crossing, was on the opposite shore, and none dared to risk the chance of swimming the river, under the impression that a large body of savages was concealed in the woods. Boone and Calloway were both absent, and night came on before arrangements could be made for their pursuit. Next morning, by daylight, we were on the track, and found they had prevented our following them by walking some distance apart through the thickest canes they could find. We observed their course, and on which side they had left their sign, and travelled upwards of 30 miles. We then imagined they would be less cautious in travelling, and made a turn in order to cross their trace, and had gone but a few miles when we found their tracks in a buffalo path. We pursued and overtook them on going about 10 miles, as they were kindling a fire to cook. Our study had been more to get the prisoners without giving the Indians time to murder them, after they discovered us, than to kill them. We discovered each other nearly at the same time. 4 of us fired, and all of us rushed in on them, which prevented them from carrying away anything except one shotgun without ammunition. Mr. Boone and myself had a pretty fair shoot, just as they began to move off. I am well convinced I shot one through, and the one he shot dropped his gun. Mine had none. The place was very thick with canes, and being so much elated on recovering the 3 broken-hearted girls, prevented our making further search. We sent them off without their moccasins, and not one of them with so much as a knife or a tomahawk. The Indians seemed to awake increasingly to the consciousness that the empire of the white man in their country could only exist upon the ruins of their own. They divided themselves into several parties, making incessant attacks upon the forts, and prowling around to shoot every white man who could be found within reach of their bullets. They avoided all open warfare, and fought only when they could spring up from an ambush, or when protected by a stump, a rock, or a tree. An Indian would conceal himself in the night behind a stump, shoot the first one who emerged from the fort in the morning, and then with a yell disappear into the recesses of the forest. The cattle could scarcely appear for an hour to graze beyond the protection of the fort, without danger of being struck down by the bullet of an unseen foe. The war of the American Revolution was just commencing. Dreadfully it added to the perils of these distant emigrants. The British government, with infamy which can never be effaced from her records, called in to aid the tomahawk and the scalping knife of the savage. The Indian alone in his wild and merciless barbarity was terrible enough, but when he appeared as the ally of a powerful nation, guided in his operations by the wisdom of her officers, and well provided with guns, powder, and bullets from inexhaustible resources, the settler had indeed reason to tremble. The winter of 1776 and 1777 was gloomy beyond expression. The Indians were hourly becoming more bold. Their predatory bands were wandering in all directions, and almost every day came fraught with tidings of outrage or massacre. The whole military force of the colony was but about 100 men. 300 of the pioneers, dismayed by the cloud of menace, every hour growing blacker, had returned across the mountains. There were but 22 armed men left in the fort at Boonesboro. The dismal winter passed slowly away, and the spring opened replete with nature's bloom and beauty, but darkened by the depravity of man. On the 15th of April, a band of 100 howling Indians appeared in the forest before Boonesboro. With far more than their ordinary audacity, they rushed from their covert upon the fort. Had they been acquainted with the use of scaling ladders, by attacking at different points, they might easily, by their superior numbers, have carried the place by storm. But fortunately the savages had but little military science, and when once repulsed, would usually retreat in dismay. The garrison, behind their impenetrable logs, took deliberate aim, and every bullet killed or wounded some Indian warrior. The savages fought with great bravery, and succeeded in killing one man in the garrison. Dismayed by the slaughter which they were encountering, they fled, taking their dead and wounded with them. But so fully were they conscious that they would retain their own supremacy in the wilderness, they must exterminate the white man, that their retreat was only in preparation for a return with accumulated numbers. An intelligent historian writes: Daniel Boone appears before us in these exciting times the central figure, towering like a colossus amid that hardy band of pioneers who opposed their breasts to the shock of the struggle which gave a terrible significance and a crimson hue to the history of the old dark and bloody ground. The Indians were scattered everywhere in desperate bands. 40 men were sent from North Carolina, and 100 from Virginia, under Colonel Bowman, to strengthen the feeble settlements. The latter party arrived on the 20th of August, 1776. There were at that time skirmishes with the Indians almost every day at some point. The pioneers within their log houses, or behind their palisades, generally repelled these assaults, with but little loss to themselves, and not often inflicting severe injury to the wary savages. In the midst of these constant conflicts and dangers, the winter months passed drearily away. Boonesboro was constantly menaced and frequently attacked. In a diary kept within the fort we find the following entries: May 23rd. A large party of Indians attacked Boonesboro Fort. Kept a warm fire till 11 o'clock at night. Began it next morning, and kept a warm fire till midnight, attempting several times to burn the fort. 3 of our men were wounded, but not mortally. May 26th. A party went out to hunt Indians. 1 wounded Squire Boone, and escaped. Very cruel warfare was now being waged by the majestic power of Great Britain to bring the revolted colonies back to subjugation to their laws. As we have mentioned, they called into requisition on their side the merciless energies of the savage, openly declaring to the world that they were justified in making use of whatever weapons God and nature might place in their hands. From the strong British garrisons at Detroit, Vincennes, at Kaskaskia, the Indians were abundantly supplied with rifles, powder and bullets, and were offered liberal rewards for such prisoners, and even scalps, as they might bring in. The danger which threatened these settlements in Kentucky was now such as might cause the stoutest heart to quail. The savage had been adopted as an ally by the most wealthy and powerful nation upon the globe. His marauding bands were often guided by the intelligence of British officers. Boone organized what might be called a corps of explorers to go out 2 and 2, penetrating the wilderness with extreme caution in all directions, to detect any indication of the approach of the Indians. One of these explorers, Simon Kenton, acting under the sagacious counsel of Colonel Boone, had obtained great and deserved celebrity as among the most heroic of the remarkable men who laid the foundation of the State of Kentucky. It would be difficult to find in any pages of romance incidents of more wonderful adventure, or of more dreadful suffering, or stories of more miraculous escape, than were experienced by this man. Several times he was taken captive by the Indians, and though treated with great inhumanity, succeeded in making his escape. The following incident in his life, occurring about this time, gives one a very vivid picture of the nature of this warfare with the Indians. Colonel Bowman sent Simon Kenton with 2 other men, Montgomery and Clark, on an exploring tour. Approaching an Indian town very cautiously in the night, on the north side of the Ohio River, they found a number of Indian horses in an enclosure. A horse in the wilderness was one of the most valuable of prizes. They accordingly each mounted an animal, not daring to leave any behind, which would aid the Indians to pursue them. By hastily constructed halters they led the rest. The noise which the horses made awoke the Indians, and the whole village was at once in a state of uproar. The mounted adventurers dashed through the woods, and were soon beyond the reach of the shouts and the yells which they left behind them. They knew, however, full well that the swift-footed Indian warriors would be immediately on their trail. Without a moment's rest they rode all night, the next day and the next night, and on the morning of the 2nd day reached the banks of the Ohio River. The flood of that majestic stream flowed broad and deep before them, and its surface was lashed into waves by a very boisterous wind. The horses could not swim across in such a gale, but their desire to retain the invaluable animals was so great that they resolved to wait upon the banks until sunset, when they expected the wind to abate. Having been so well mounted and having such a start of the Indians, they did not suppose it possible that their pursuers could overtake them before that time. Night came, but with it an increase of the fury of the gale, and the stream became utterly impassable. Early in the morning, Kenton, who was separated from his companions, observed 3 Indians and a white man, well mounted, rapidly approaching. Raising his rifle, he took steady aim at the breast of the foremost Indian, and pulled the trigger. The powder flashed in the pan. Kenton took to his heels, but was soon overtaken and captured. The Indians seemed greatly exasperated at the loss of their horses. One seized him by the hair and shook his head till his teeth rattled. The others scourged him severely with their ramrods over the head and face, exclaiming at every blow, "Steal Indian hoss, hey?" Just then Kenton saw Montgomery coming boldly to his assistance. Instantly 2 Indian rifles were discharged, and Montgomery fell dead. His bloody scalp was waved in the face of Kenton, with menaces of a similar fate. Clark had sought safety in flight. Kenton was thrown upon the ground upon his back. His neck was fastened by a halter to a sapling. His arms, extended to their full length, were pinioned to the earth by stakes. His feet were fastened in a similar manner. A stout stick was passed across his breast, and so attached to the earth that he could not move his body. All this was done in the most violent and cruel manner, accompanied by frequent cuffs and blows, as the maddened Indians called him in the broken English which they had acquired, a "tief," a "hoss steal," a "rascal," which expressions the Indians had learned to intersperse with English oaths. In this condition of suffering Kenton remained through the day and through the night. The next morning the savages, having collected their scattered horses, put Kenton upon a young colt, tied his hands behind him and his feet beneath the horse's belly, and set out on their return. The country was rough, and Kenton could not at all protect himself from the brambles through which they passed. Thus they rode all day. When night came, their prisoner was bound to the earth as before. The next day they reached the Indian village, which was called Chillicothe, on the Miami River, 40 or 50 miles west of the present city of Chillicothe, Ohio. A courier was sent forward to inform the village of their arrival. Every man, woman and child came running out to view the prisoner. One of their chiefs, Blackfish, approached Kenton with a strong hickory switch in his hand, and addressing him, said, "You have been stealing our horses, have you?" "Yes," was the defiant reply. "Did Colonel Boone," inquired the chief, "tell you to steal our horses?" "No," said Kenton, "I did it of my own accord." Blackfish then with brawny arms so mercilessly applied the scourge to the bare head and shoulders of his prisoner, as to cause the blood to flow freely, and to occasion the acutest pain. In the meantime the whole crowd of men, women and children danced and hooted and clapped their hands, assailing him with the choicest epithets of Indian vituperation. With loud cries they demanded that he should be tied to the stake, that they might all enjoy the pleasure of tormenting him. A stake was immediately planted in the ground, and he was firmly fastened to it. His entire clothing was torn from him, mainly by the Indian women. The whole party then danced around him until midnight, yelling in the most frantic manner, smiting him with their hands and lacerating his flesh with their switches. At midnight they released him from the stake, and allowed him some little repose, in preparation for their principal amusement in the morning, of having their prisoner run the gauntlet. 300 Indians of all ages and both sexes were assembled for the savage festival. The Indians were ranged in 2 parallel lines, about 6 feet apart, all armed with sticks, hickory rods, whips, and other means of inflicting torture. Between these lines, for more than half a mile to the village, The wretched prisoner was doomed to run for his life, exposed to such injury as his tormentors could inflict as he passed. If he succeeded in reaching the council house alive, it would prove an asylum to him for the present. At a given signal, Kenton started in the perilous race. Exerting his utmost strength and activity, he passed swiftly along the line, receiving numerous blows, stripes, buffets, and wounds, until he approached the town, near which he saw an Indian leisurely awaiting his advance with a knife drawn in his hand, intent upon his death. To avoid him, he instantly broke through the line, and made his rapid way towards the council house, pursued by the promiscuous crowd, whooping and yelling like infernal furies at his heels. Entering the town in advance of his pursuers, just as he supposed the council house within his reach, an Indian was perceived leisurely approaching him with his blanket wrapped around him. But suddenly he threw off the blanket and sprung upon Kenton as he advanced. Exhausted with fatigue and wounds, he was thrown to the ground, and in a moment he was beset with crowds, eager to inflict upon him the kick or blow which had been avoided by breaking through the line. Here, beaten, kicked, and scourged, until he was nearly lifeless, he was left to die. A few hours afterwards he was supplied with food and water, and was suffered to recuperate for a few days, until he was enabled to attend at the council house, and receive the announcement of his final doom. It was here decided that he should be made a public sacrifice to the vengeance of the nation. The Indian town of Wappatomica, upon the present site of Zanesville, Ohio, was the appointed place of his execution. Being in a state of utter exhaustion, his escape was deemed impossible, and he was carelessly guarded. In despair, he attempted it. He was promptly recaptured and punished by being taken to a neighboring creek, where he was dragged through the mud and water till life was nearly extinct. Still his constitutional vigor triumphed, and he revived. Wappatomica was a British trading post. Here Kenton met an old comrade, Simon Girty, who had become a renegade, had joined the Indians, and had so adopted their dress and manners as hardly to be distinguished from his savage associates. Girty cautiously endeavored to save the condemned prisoner. He represented to the band that it would be of great advantage to them to have possession of one so intimately acquainted with all the white settlements and their resources. A respite was granted. Another council was held. The spirit of Indian revenge prevailed. Kenton was again doomed to death, to be preceded by the terrible ordeal of running the gauntlet. But a British officer, influenced by the persuasions of the Indian chief Logan, the friend of the white man, urged upon the Indian chiefs that the British officers at Detroit would regard the possession of Kenton, with the information he had at his command, as a great acquisition, and that they would pay for him a ransom of at least $100. They took him to Detroit. The ransom was paid, and Kenton became the prisoner of the British officers, instead of savage chieftains. Still he was a prisoner, though treated with ordinary humanity, and was allowed the liberty of the town. There were two other American captives there, Captain Nathan Bullitt and Jesse Coffer. Escape seemed impossible, as it could only be effected through a wilderness 400 miles in extent, crowded with wandering Indian bands, where they would be eminently exposed to recapture or to death by starvation. Simon Kenton was a very handsome man. He won the sympathies of a very kind English woman, Mrs. Harvey, the wife of one of the traders at the post. She secretly obtained for him and his two companions, and concealed in a hollow tree, powder, lead, moccasins, and a quantity of dried beef. One dark night, when the Indians were engaged in a drunken bout, she met Kenton in the garden and handed him 3 of the best rifles, which she had selected from those stacked near the house. The biographer of these events writes: "When a woman engages to do an action, she will risk limb, life, or character, to serve him whom she respects or wishes to befriend. How differently the same action would be viewed by different persons! By Kenton and his friends her conduct was viewed as the benevolent conduct of a good angel. while if the part she played in behalf of Kenton and his companions had been known to the commander at Detroit, she would have been looked upon as a traitress, who merited the scorn and contempt of all honest citizens. This night was the last that Kenton ever saw or heard of her. Our fugitives traveled mostly by night, guided by the stars. After passing through a series of wonderful adventures, which we have not space here to record, on the 33rd day of their escape they reached the settlement at the Falls of the Ohio, now Louisville. During the rest of the war, Kenton was a very active partisan. He died in the year 1836, over 80 years of age, having been for more than a quarter of a century an honored member of the Methodist Church. Chapter 7.